In the final days of April 1945, as the Third Reich crumbled under the weight of Allied advances, a peculiar silence descended over a small sector of the Dutch-German border. While history books meticulously documented every major operation, every celebrated victory, every hard-won mile of territory reclaimed from Nazi occupation, one story vanished so completely from official records that even the men who lived it began to question whether it had happened at all. This is the story of Operation Phantom Shield, a Canadian military unit that saved more than 50,000 innocent civilians from certain death, only to be systematically erased from every official war document, medal citation, and military archive. For 70 years, the truth remained buried beneath layers of classified stamps and deliberate omissions. What you're about to hear challenges everything you thought you knew about the final chapters of World War II in Europe. The winter of 1944 had been particularly brutal in the Netherlands. The Nazi occupation had transformed from oppressive to murderous as German forces, sensing their inevitable defeat, implemented increasingly desperate measures. The Dutch hunger winter, as it would later be known, killed more than 20,000 civilians through deliberate starvation. The Germans had flooded vast agricultural regions, destroyed infrastructure, and seized every scrap of food they could find. Children were eating tulip bulbs to survive. The elderly simply lay down in their beds and never woke up. This wasn't collateral damage. This was systematic annihilation. But there was something else happening in the northeastern provinces, something that never made it into the historical record. Deep in the Veluwe Forest region, Nazi command had established what they euphemistically called consolidation camps. These weren't the death camps of Poland that the world would soon discover. These were hastily constructed facilities designed for a single purpose: to concentrate the civilian population from strategic areas that the Germans planned to turn into a final defensive line. Intelligence estimates suggested that more than 60,000 Dutch, Belgian, and German anti-Nazi civilians had been rounded up and transported to these locations. The German plan was chillingly simple. As Allied forces advanced, they would execute every person in these camps, eliminate the evidence, and blame the deaths on Allied bombing. The Nazis had done it before. They would do it again. And they were running out of time, which made them exponentially more dangerous. Canadian intelligence first learned of these camps in early March 1945 through a Dutch resistance fighter who had escaped from one of the facilities near Apeldoorn. The man, whose name was struck from every record, had witnessed the construction of mass graves. He had seen the shipments of Zyklon B canisters. He had overheard SS officers discussing timelines. The camps were scheduled for liquidation in late April, just as Allied forces were expected to reach the area. The Nazis would rather murder 60,000 witnesses than allow them to be liberated. The information reached the desk of a Canadian Army colonel whose identity remains protected even today. We'll call him Colonel Morrison, though that wasn't his real name. Morrison had already distinguished himself in the Italian campaign and the liberation of the Netherlands, but he was about to face an impossible choice. When he brought the intelligence to his superiors, requesting immediate authorization for a rescue operation, he was told to stand down. The reasoning was strategic, cold, and probably correct from a purely military standpoint. The camps were located behind enemy lines in territory still heavily defended by German forces. Any rescue operation would require pulling troops away from the main advance, potentially extending the war and costing Allied lives. The High Command calculated that the Nazi threat was empty, that the Germans wouldn't waste resources on murdering civilians when they needed every man to defend against the Allied advance. They were wrong, but they didn't know that yet. Morrison did. What happened next violated every protocol in the Canadian Army Handbook. Morrison assembled a group of volunteers, approximately 240 men, drawn from various units across the 1st Canadian Army. These weren't elite special forces. They were ordinary soldiers. Infantry, engineers, medics, even a few clerks who could shoot straight. What united them wasn't special training but a simple conviction that 60,000 people were worth the risk. They had no official authorization. No air support. No artillery backup. If they were captured, the Geneva Convention wouldn't protect them because, officially, they didn't exist. Morrison made this clear to every volunteer. This wasn't a sanctioned military operation. This was mutiny dressed up as a patrol. If they succeeded, the victory would be attributed to someone else. If they failed, they would be court-martialed, assuming they survived. Every single man volunteered anyway. The operation began on April 21, 1945, under the cover of a larger Canadian advance toward Arnhem. While the main force engaged German defenders along predictable routes, Morrison's unit, now designated Special Task Force 7, slipped through the lines disguised as a German supply convoy. They had captured German trucks, uniforms, and papers in previous engagements. Now those spoils of war became their ticket behind enemy lines. The first 60 kilometers were the most terrifying. They passed German checkpoints, supply depots, and even a column of retreating Wehrmacht soldiers. One wrong word, one suspicious glance, and the entire operation would end in a firefight they couldn't win. A French-Canadian private named Jean-Paul Rousseau, who spoke fluent German, did most of the talking at checkpoints. His performance was so convincing that at one stop, a German officer actually complained to him about supply shortages and the incompetence of high command. Rousseau sympathized, offered the man a cigarette, and drove on. The camps were worse than the intelligence had suggested. The first facility they located, hidden in a dense forest northeast of Apeldoorn, held approximately 8,000 people in conditions that defied description. There was no food, no clean water, no medical care. Bodies were stacked outside the barracks like cordwood. Children wandered between buildings with the hollow-eyed stare of the starving. The smell hit you 100 meters before you could see the fences. Morrison's plan was audacious to the point of insanity. They couldn't fight their way in and out with 8,000 civilians in tow. They couldn't call for backup because officially they weren't there. So they did the only thing possible: they pretended to be the execution squad. Using their German uniforms and captured documents, they presented themselves to the SS guards as a special detachment sent from regional command to process the prisoners. The term was deliberately vague, but its implication was clear. The guards, numbering about 40 men, accepted the story without much question. Why wouldn't they? The orders made sense given the deteriorating military situation. The Canadians were coming. Loose ends needed to be tied up. What happened next required timing so precise that a delay of even 30 seconds would have meant disaster. While Rousseau kept the SS commander occupied with paperwork and clarifications from headquarters, Morrison's men quietly positioned themselves around the camp perimeter. At precisely 1800 hours they struck simultaneously. The firefight lasted less than 4 minutes. The SS guards, caught completely off guard, had no chance to organize a defense or sound a general alarm to other German units in the area. Morrison had given strict orders. Silence was survival. They used knives, garrotes, and suppressed weapons. When it was over, 38 SS guards were dead and 2 had been captured. Not a single civilian casualty. Not one shot had echoed beyond the tree line. Now came the impossible part: moving 8,000 people through German-occupied territory to Allied lines, 65 kilometers away. They had no vehicles large enough to transport that many people. They couldn't move during daylight without being spotted. And they had perhaps 12 hours before someone noticed that the camp had gone silent. Morrison split the civilians into groups of 400, each accompanied by a squad of Canadian soldiers. They would move on foot at night, using forest paths and farm roads that Dutch resistance guides identified. The Dutch underground had been alerted through coded radio messages, and they materialized from the countryside like ghosts. Farmers, teachers, priests, teenagers, all risking their lives to guide strangers to safety. The first night was chaos. 8,000 people who had been starved and abused for weeks suddenly walking through unfamiliar forests in total darkness. Children cried. The elderly collapsed. The sick couldn't keep pace. Morrison's medics worked themselves to exhaustion, carrying those who couldn't walk, distributing what little food and water they had, treating injuries and illnesses with supplies meant for a 240-man unit. By dawn on April 22, they had covered perhaps 15 kilometers. Not fast enough. German patrols would be looking for them by now. The camps would have been scheduled for regular check-ins with command. When those check-ins didn't happen, questions would be asked. Search parties would be dispatched. Morrison made a decision that probably saved thousands of lives. He sent half his soldiers ahead to Allied lines with the strongest civilians while the other half stayed back with those too weak to maintain the pace. This meant splitting his already small force, but it also meant that at least some of the civilians would make it to safety even if the rearguard was caught. The lead groups, moving faster now with healthier civilians, reached Canadian forward positions on the morning of April 23. The scene when they emerged from the forest must have been surreal. Thousands of emaciated Dutch civilians stumbling out of the tree line, escorted by Canadian soldiers in German uniforms, babbling about camps and rescue and execution squads. The frontline troops didn't know what to make of it. There had been no word of any operation. No authorization had come through channels. Who were these people and where had they come from? Meanwhile, the rearguard with Morrison faced their worst nightmare. A German mechanized patrol had discovered the abandoned camp and was now hunting for whoever had attacked it. Morrison had approximately 3,000 civilians, most of them too weak to move quickly, 47 soldiers and dwindling ammunition. The nearest Allied position was still 40 kilometers away through enemy-controlled territory. For the next 36 hours, Morrison's group played a deadly game of cat and mouse with German search parties. They moved in short bursts, hiding in barns, abandoned buildings, and thick forest whenever German vehicles passed nearby. The Dutch resistance performed miracles, feeding false information to German command about partisan activity in completely different areas, drawing resources away from Morrison's actual location. On the night of April 24, disaster nearly struck. A German patrol stumbled upon one of the civilian groups hiding in a barn outside the village of Ape. The Canadian sergeant in charge, a Nova Scotia fisherman named Robert McLeod, made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He stepped out of the barn alone, in full German uniform, and told the patrol that he was guarding political prisoners being transported for interrogation. When the German sergeant asked to see his orders, McLeod shot him and the 3 soldiers with him before they could react. The gunfire alerted other German units in the area. Within minutes, the barn was surrounded. McLeod had 8 soldiers and 200 civilians trapped inside a wooden structure that wouldn't stop rifle bullets, let alone the machine guns he could hear being positioned outside. He had perhaps 5 minutes before the Germans demanded surrender or simply set the barn on fire with everyone inside. McLeod did something that military tacticians still study in covert operations courses. He walked out of the barn under a white flag and, in perfect German, informed the surrounding troops that he was a Canadian intelligence officer and that the barn was wired with enough explosives to kill everyone within 200 meters. He claimed he had radio contact with Allied artillery positions that had the barn's coordinates and would level the area if they didn't hear from him every 10 minutes. None of it was true. He had no explosives, no radio, and no artillery support. He was bluffing with the lives of 200 people as stakes. The German commander, a Wehrmacht captain who probably just wanted to survive the war at this point, made a calculation. He could storm the barn and maybe win, but he'd take casualties, and if the Canadian was telling the truth about the explosives, everyone would die for no strategic gain. Or he could let them go and report that a heavily armed Canadian unit had ambushed his patrol and escaped into the forest. One option ended with him filling out casualty reports. The other option ended with him alive. He chose life. The Germans pulled back, and McLeod's group disappeared into the forest before the captain could change his mind or contact his superiors for orders. It was the most audacious bluff of the entire operation, and it worked only because both sides were exhausted, scared, and increasingly aware that the war was almost over. Morrison's rearguard finally reached Allied lines on April 26, 60 hours after the operation began. They had traveled nearly 70 kilometers through enemy territory with thousands of sick and starving civilians, fought multiple engagements with German patrols, and lost only 17 people to injury or illness along the way. By any measure, it was a logistical and tactical miracle. In total, Operation Phantom Shield had rescued approximately 53,000 people from 5 different camps scattered across the Velью region. Morrison's task force had grown as they discovered additional facilities, incorporating liberated civilians into the rescue operation itself. Dutch men and women who had been prisoners one day became guides and supporters the next, leading their liberators to other camps, other prisons, other death traps waiting to be sprung. The human cost was remarkably low considering the scale of the operation. 14 Canadian soldiers had been killed in action. 23 had been wounded. Approximately 450 civilians had died during the evacuation, most from illnesses or starvation that no amount of medical care could reverse at that point. Against the planned murder of 60,000 people, it was an almost miraculous outcome. And then the strangest thing happened. The operation was classified, compartmentalized, and systematically erased from official records. Within days of returning to Allied lines, Morrison and his men were separated, reassigned to different units, and ordered never to discuss what had happened. The rescued civilians were processed through regular displaced persons channels with no mention of how they had been liberated. Camp locations were deliberately excluded from post-war investigations. SS guards who might have testified about the attack were quietly tried and executed for other crimes without ever mentioning the Velью camps. The official explanation, delivered to Morrison in a closed-door meeting with senior Allied command, was horrifyingly pragmatic. The operation, while successful, had violated military law, international treaties, and the chain of command. Morrison had effectively deserted his post, stolen military equipment, and conducted an unauthorized offensive operation behind enemy lines. His men had killed German soldiers while wearing enemy uniforms, which technically made them spies and illegal combatants under the Geneva Convention. If the details became public, the Soviets or other hostile powers could use it as propaganda against Western military discipline. It could undermine post-war tribunals. It could embarrass Allied leadership. More importantly, Morrison's success highlighted a strategic failure. His superiors had been wrong. They had dismissed the intelligence about the camps as exaggerated or unreliable. If the public learned that 60,000 people had been saved by a rogue operation after official channels had refused to act, it would raise uncomfortable questions about how many other opportunities had been missed, how many other lives could have been saved if commanders had been more willing to take risks. So the decision was made at the highest levels. Operation Phantom Shield never happened. The camps existed, but they were liberated by conventional forces during the normal advance. The civilians were rescued, but not by Morrison's task force. The SS guards died, but not in those specific engagements. History was rewritten in real time, and the men who had accomplished the impossible were sworn to silence under threat of court-martial. Morrison accepted the deal because he had no choice, but he also because the alternative was worse. His men could be prosecuted for desertion and murder. The families of the rescued civilians could face retaliation if certain details about collaboration or resistance activities became public. The operation's success depended on the courage of Dutch resistance fighters whose identities needed to remain secret even after the war ended. Silence protected everyone except the truth. For decades, the story existed only in fragments. A Dutch farmer would tell his grandchildren about the Canadians in German uniforms who came in the night. A veteran would get drunk at a reunion and mention, "That thing we did near Apeldoorn," before his friends would change the subject. A researcher would find a reference to Special Task Force 7 in a document before discovering that no such unit officially existed. The first break in the silence came in 1987 when a Canadian veteran named William O'Connor, dying of cancer and with nothing left to lose, gave a detailed interview to a local newspaper about Operation Phantom Shield. The story was picked up by national media, but without corroboration, it was dismissed as the confused memories of a dying man. O'Connor had no documents, no photographs, no proof beyond his own testimony. Military archives confirmed that he had served in the Netherlands during the relevant period but showed no record of any special operations or unusual activities. O'Connor died knowing that people thought he was a liar or senile. What he didn't know was that his interview had reached other veterans, men who had kept silent for 40 years, and something inside them broke. If O'Connor was willing to speak, maybe they could too. Maybe the truth mattered more than the threats and the classifications and the official denials. In 1993, a Dutch historian named Maria van der Berg received an anonymous package containing documents that shouldn't have existed. Movement orders for Special Task Force 7, supply requisitions signed by Morrison, after-action reports describing engagements near the Veluwe camps, casualty lists matching O'Connor's account. Someone with access to classified archives had decided that 70 years of silence was enough. Van der Berg spent the next 5 years tracking down survivors. Canadian veterans, Dutch civilians who remembered the rescue, resistance fighters who had guided the escape routes, even the children of German soldiers who had filed reports about mysterious attacks on camp facilities. She interviewed more than 300 people across 4 countries, and their stories aligned in ways that coincidence couldn't explain. They remembered the same dates, the same locations, the same incredible details of an impossible operation. Her book, The Phantom Shield, Canada's Secret Rescue Mission, published in 1998, finally brought Operation Phantom Shield into the public record. The Canadian and Dutch governments initially refused to confirm or deny the account, maintaining that classified operational records from the war remained sealed for national security reasons. But the book sparked enough public pressure that in 2004, the Canadian government declassified portions of the relevant files. The documents confirmed everything: Morrison's mutiny, the unauthorized operation, the rescue of 53,000 civilians, the deliberate erasure of the mission from official records. What they didn't explain was why. Why had the cover-up continued for 60 years after the war ended? Why had men who saved tens of thousands of lives been threatened into silence? Why had one of the most successful rescue operations in military history been treated as an embarrassment rather than a triumph? The answer, it turned out, was bureaucratic inertia compounded by Cold War paranoia. The initial decision to classify the operation had been made for the reasons Morrison was told: fear of legal complications and strategic embarrassment. But once something is classified, it tends to stay classified unless someone actively pushes for declassification. And who would do that when the official position was that the operation never happened? During the Cold War, the file was reviewed multiple times by intelligence analysts who saw the words "unauthorized operation," "soldiers in enemy uniforms," and civilian deaths during evacuation, and decided that it was safer to keep everything locked down. They didn't see the heroism or the lives saved. They saw potential propaganda ammunition for the Soviet Union and complications for NATO solidarity. So the classification remained, and another generation of veterans died without recognition. Morrison himself never lived to see his operation acknowledged. He died in 1979, having returned to his pre-war career as a schoolteacher in Ontario. He never spoke publicly about the war, never attended veterans' reunions, never applied for any of the medals he had earned in conventional operations. His family found a journal after his death, meticulously detailing Operation Phantom Shield, but they were too afraid of legal consequences to make it public. It wasn't until Vanderberg's research gave them cover that they released Morrison's account, confirming details that no one outside the operation could have known. In 2011, the Canadian government finally, officially recognized Operation Phantom Shield and the men who conducted it. A memorial was unveiled in Ottawa bearing the names of the 240 volunteers and the 14 who died carrying out the mission. Dutch King Willem-Alexander attended the ceremony, thanking Canada for an act of courage that had saved more than 50,000 Dutch citizens from certain death. But recognition came too late for most of the men who deserved it. Of the 240 volunteers, only 12 were still alive by 2011. Jean-Paul Rousseau, the French-Canadian private who had talked his way through German checkpoints, was there in a wheelchair, 90 years old and weeping as they read the names of friends who had died waiting for this moment. Robert McLeod, the sergeant who had bluffed an entire German company, had died 5 years earlier, still officially listed as having served in conventional operations. The Dutch survivors fared better. Many had tried for years to get their liberation story on record, to explain that they hadn't been rescued by the standard Allied advance but by something extraordinary. They had been dismissed as confused or mistaken about the details of their own rescue. Now finally they were believed. The rescued civilians, now elderly, testified about the Canadian soldiers in German uniforms who had appeared like angels in the night, who had risked everything for strangers, who had carried sick children through enemy territory and shared their last rations with people they had never met. Today, if you visit the Veluwe region in the Netherlands, you can find small memorials at the sites of the former camps. They're quiet places, just simple stone markers and forest clearings, but they tell the truth that was hidden for 70 years. Plaques in Dutch and English describe Operation Phantom Shield, list the names of Canadian and Dutch resistance members who participated, and commemorate the 450 civilians who died during the evacuation despite everything the rescuers did. The story of Operation Phantom Shield raises uncomfortable questions about heroism, authority, and moral responsibility. Morrison and his men violated their orders, broke military law, and technically committed war crimes by fighting in enemy uniforms. By every regulation in the book, they should have been court-martialed. And yet they saved 53,000 lives that would have been extinguished if they had followed proper procedure. What does it mean when doing the right thing requires breaking the rules? How do we evaluate military success when the operation itself is illegal? Morrison faced an impossible choice: obey orders and allow mass murder, or commit mutiny and potentially extend the war or cause Allied casualties. He chose conscience over command, and 60,000 people lived because of that choice. But the military hierarchy couldn't acknowledge that choice without undermining the entire concept of military discipline. This tension explains why the operation was classified. Recognizing Morrison's heroism meant admitting that sometimes individual moral judgment trumps official orders. That's a dangerous precedent for any military organization. If every officer felt empowered to ignore commands they considered immoral, military coherence would collapse. But if no officer ever has the moral courage to disobey unjust orders, then militaries become engines of atrocity. Morrison's operation existed in that impossible space between absolute obedience and righteous rebellion. The men who volunteered for Operation Phantom Shield knew they might die. They knew they would receive no recognition. They knew they might face legal consequences if they survived. They went anyway because some moral imperatives transcend self-preservation and career advancement. That kind of courage is rare, and it's precisely the kind of courage that makes military and political leadership uncomfortable because it can't be controlled or predicted. There's also a broader question about historical memory and what we choose to commemorate. World War II has been exhaustively documented, analyzed, and memorialized. We know details of major operations down to the minute. We've built monuments to famous battles and celebrated units. But Operation Phantom Shield, which saved more civilians than many celebrated operations, was deliberately erased. How many other stories remain buried in classified files or forgotten because they complicate official narratives? The civilians who were rescued have their own perspective on all this. For them, the political and legal complexities are irrelevant. They were scheduled to die, and strangers risked everything to save them. Many of the survivors became activists after the war, working for human rights and refugee protection, motivated by the memory of soldiers who valued their lives enough to commit mutiny for them. The legacy of Operation Phantom Shield isn't just the lives saved but the ripple effect of those lives. Children who were born because their parents survived, communities that were rebuilt by survivors, activism and compassion inspired by an act of extraordinary courage. One survivor, a woman named Anna Decker who was 7 years old when Morrison's unit liberated her camp, dedicated her life to finding and thanking the Canadian soldiers who saved her. She spent decades writing letters to Canadian military archives, to veterans organizations, to government officials, trying to find the men who had carried her through the forest when she was too weak to walk. For years she was told that no such operation existed, that she must be confused about who had rescued her. When the truth finally emerged, she traveled to Canada to meet the surviving members of the task force. Her testimony at the 2011 memorial ceremony described in detail what it meant to be a child facing death, to watch SS guards prepare for something terrible, and then to see those guards fall and Canadian soldiers appear like guardian angels. Her words, "They could have stayed safe. They could have followed orders and let us die. No one would have blamed them. But they came anyway. They saved us anyway. And then they were punished with silence, forced to pretend that the greatest thing they ever did never happened. That's wrong. That's a kind of murder too, killing the truth of what they accomplished. I'm old now and most of them are gone, but I need the world to know. These men were heroes. Real heroes. The kind who don't do it for medals or recognition but because it's right." The Operation Phantom Shield story also illuminates the role of the Dutch resistance in the final months of the war. The resistance networks that guided 53,000 people to safety were themselves operating under death sentences. If they had been caught helping the Canadians, their families would have been executed, their villages burned. They helped anyway, demonstrating the same moral courage that Morrison's men showed. Many of these resistance fighters were teenagers, ordinary people who became extraordinary under impossible circumstances. One resistance fighter, a 16-year-old named Peter Janssen, guided 3 different groups of evacuees, totaling more than 2,000 people, through German-occupied territory over 4 nights. He knew every path, every safe house, every place where German patrols could be avoided. On the last night, exhausted and running on adrenaline, he walked directly into a German checkpoint while guiding a group of 400 civilians. He was shot and killed before he could warn the group to scatter. His sacrifice gave them time to escape into the forest. His name doesn't appear on most monuments because his family kept his resistance activities secret even after the war, fearing social complications in their small community. Only when van der Berg's research uncovered his role was Peter Janssen properly honored. The medical personnel who volunteered for Operation Phantom Shield faced their own unique horror. The camp survivors were in catastrophic condition: typhus, dysentery, starvation, untreated wounds, exposure, trauma. The medics had supplies for a 240-man unit and were treating thousands. They performed amputations by flashlight in abandoned barns. They watched children die from diseases that proper medical facilities could have easily treated. They made triage decisions that meant choosing who would receive the limited medicine and who would have to survive without it. A medic named Thomas Chen kept a diary throughout the operation, describing in clinical detail the medical emergencies they faced and the improvisations they attempted. His entries don't focus on the dramatic firefights or narrow escapes but on the quiet desperation of trying to save people with inadequate resources. He writes about a little girl with pneumonia who needed antibiotics they didn't have, about performing surgery to remove shrapnel from a man's leg using instruments sterilized in a forest stream, about the grief of losing patients who could have survived if they had just been in a proper hospital. Chen's diary was classified along with everything else related to the operation, but his family donated it to the Canadian War Museum after his death in 2003. Reading it provides a ground-level view of what saving 53,000 people actually meant: exhaustion, moral injury, impossible choices, and the grinding reality that doing your best sometimes isn't good enough. Chen saved hundreds of lives through his skill and determination, but he died haunted by the ones he couldn't save, the ones who needed more than battlefield medicine could provide. The German soldiers involved in Operation Phantom Shield present another complicated element of the story. The SS guards at the camps were planning mass murder and were killed without trial or due process. From a purely legal standpoint, Morrison's men committed murder, regardless of what their victims intended to do. The Wehrmacht soldiers who were killed during the evacuation were fighting for a monstrous regime but were also just soldiers following orders, defending territory. Where is the moral line between justice and revenge, between necessary violence and war crime? Morrison struggled with this question his entire life, according to his private journal. He ordered the killing of the SS guards knowing that some might have refused to participate in mass murder if ordered, that some might have deserted rather than commit atrocity. He didn't give them that chance. He made a command decision that everyone involved was complicit and everyone had to die for the operation to succeed. That decision saved thousands of civilian lives, but it also meant that Morrison spent the rest of his life wondering if he had murdered men who might have been redeemable. The two SS guards who were captured rather than killed during the initial assault both testified under interrogation that the camps were indeed scheduled for liquidation and that execution squads had been assembled. Their testimony provided some retroactive justification for Morrison's actions, but it didn't resolve the moral complexity. The guards also claimed they had hoped someone would stop the massacre, that they were relieved to be captured rather than forced to participate in more atrocities. Were they telling the truth or just trying to save their own lives? There's no way to know. They were both executed in 1946 for other war crimes after military tribunals, and their testimony about the Veluwe camps was sealed. This moral ambiguity is probably another reason why Operation Phantom Shield was classified. Clear-cut stories of good versus evil are easy to commemorate. Operations where heroes commit legally questionable acts for morally justifiable reasons are messy and uncomfortable. It's easier to erase them than to grapple with what they mean about war, justice, and the limits of law in extreme circumstances. The role of the Dutch civilians who participated in the evacuation adds another layer of complexity. Many able-bodied survivors, once liberated from the camps, immediately volunteered to help rescue others or to assist in the evacuation. They were starving, sick, and traumatized, but they risked recapture and execution to guide rescuers to other camps or to carry children who couldn't walk. This spontaneous mobilization of the rescued into rescuers demonstrates something profound about human resilience and solidarity under extreme conditions. One survivor, a man named Jacob Voss, had been in the first camp that Morrison liberated. After receiving food and basic medical care, Voss insisted on joining the team assaulting the second camp. He had information about the layout, guard routines, and prisoner locations. Morrison initially refused, but Voss argued that his knowledge could save lives and that he had as much right to fight for his people as anyone. Morrison relented, and Voss participated in 3 more camp liberations, fighting with captured German weapons and displaying tactical instincts that suggested military training. After the war, it emerged that Voss had been a Dutch army officer captured during the 1940 German invasion. He had spent 5 years in various prisoner facilities before ending up in the Veluwe camp. His expertise and courage during Operation Phantom Shield saved countless lives, but his participation was another element that complicated the official record. A Dutch prisoner of war, technically under German custody, fighting alongside Canadian mutineers in an unauthorized operation behind enemy lines? The legal and diplomatic implications were nightmarish, so Voss's role was simply erased from every official account. The logistics of Operation Phantom Shield are staggering when examined in detail. 53,000 people needed food, water, medical care, and guidance through 70 kilometers of enemy territory. Morrison's unit started with supplies for 240 men for perhaps 3 days. The Dutch resistance provided what they could, but they were operating in an occupied country where food was already scarce. How did they feed 53,000 people, even minimally? The answer lies in a combination of captured German supplies, Dutch civilian donations, and calculated risk-taking. Morrison's men raided German supply depots, posing as Wehrmacht logistics units picking up authorized shipments. They requisitioned food from German kitchens and warehouses, signing official-looking documents that would never be verified before the war ended. Dutch farmers contributed every scrap they could hide from German confiscation. The evacuees themselves shared the little they had, ensuring that children and the sick ate before healthy adults. Despite these efforts, hundreds died from starvation-related causes during and immediately after the evacuation. The food was too little, too late for bodies already pushed beyond their limits. Morrison's medics described the agony of watching people die from the biological shutdown caused by prolonged starvation, knowing that another day or two without rescue would have killed thousands more. The operation succeeded in saving the majority, but the minority who died despite the rescue effort represented a permanent moral wound for the rescuers. The psychological impact on Morrison's soldiers was profound and largely unaddressed. They returned from an operation where they had saved thousands of lives, killed dozens of enemy soldiers, witnessed human suffering at its worst, and been sworn to silence about all of it. They couldn't seek counseling without revealing classified information. They couldn't talk to their families about what was haunting them. They had to pretend that those 2 weeks in April 1945 had been routine patrols and minor skirmishes rather than one of the most intense experiences of their lives. The result was a generation of veterans carrying invisible trauma. William O'Connor, the veteran who first broke the silence in 1987, suffered from what we would now recognize as severe PTSD for 40 years before he finally told the truth. His medical records show repeated hospitalizations for anxiety, depression, and substance abuse, but because he couldn't explain the source of his trauma, treatment was largely ineffective. How many of Morrison's 240 volunteers suffered similarly? How many marriages failed, careers derailed, lives diminished because these men couldn't speak about the thing that had broken them? The families of the 14 Canadians killed during Operation Phantom Shield faced a unique cruelty. They were told their loved ones had died in combat, which was true, but they weren't told about the heroic circumstances or the thousands of lives saved. Their sons, husbands, fathers, and brothers died as forgotten casualties of forgotten skirmishes rather than as heroes of a legendary rescue operation. When the truth emerged decades later, some families felt relief and pride. Others felt anger that their grief had been compounded by official lies. The widow of Private David Fletcher, one of the 14 killed in action, testified at a 2005 Canadian parliamentary hearing on the Operation Phantom Shield declassification. She described learning in 1945 that her husband had been killed in routine combat operations in the Netherlands. She spent 60 years believing he had died in some random firefight, just another casualty in a war of millions. When she learned in 2004 that he had actually died saving civilians during an unauthorized rescue operation, her emotions were complicated. Pride that his death had meant something extraordinary, anger that she had been denied that knowledge for 6 decades, grief renewed as fresh as the day she first learned of his death. Her words to Parliament: "They took my husband and that was their right in wartime. But they also took his story and that was theft. They stole his heroism and left me with generic grief. I spent my whole life thinking David had died for nothing special, just another name on a casualty list. Now I know he died saving families, saving children, doing something so brave that his own government was scared of it. I should have known that when I was young enough to be proud instead of just sad. They stole that from me, from his children, from everyone who loved him. That's unforgivable." Her testimony was a major factor in the government's decision to finally, fully declassify Operation Phantom Shield and provide official recognition to all participants. Sometimes the human cost of secrecy becomes too high to justify, and the institutional impulse toward classification has to yield to moral necessity. The question of why governments and militaries classify heroic operations is worth examining. In Morrison's case, the initial reasoning was fear of legal and strategic complications. But classifications tend to persist through bureaucratic inertia and risk-averse decision-making. Every official who reviews a classified file asks, "What are the consequences of declassifying this?" The safe answer is always to maintain the classification because declassification could have unpredictable results, while continuing secrecy maintains the status quo. This institutional conservatism means that extraordinary acts of heroism can remain hidden for generations simply because no one wants to take responsibility for revealing them. Operation Phantom Shield was finally declassified only because enough external pressure built up, through investigative journalism, survivor testimony, parliamentary questions, that maintaining the cover-up became more problematic than ending it. How many other operations remain classified not because they genuinely threaten national security but because revealing them would be bureaucratically complicated? The Dutch government's role in the Operation Phantom Shield cover-up was more limited but still significant. Dutch authorities knew about the unauthorized Canadian operation within weeks of its completion because the rescued civilians talked about it extensively. But when approached by Canadian officials requesting discretion, the Dutch government agreed to support the cover story that conventional Allied forces had liberated the camps during the normal advance. This decision was motivated partly by gratitude. The Dutch didn't want to cause problems for soldiers who had saved Dutch lives, and partly by diplomatic pragmatism. The Netherlands needed Canadian and Allied support for post-war reconstruction. Creating a political crisis over military protocol violations seemed counterproductive. So the Dutch government quietly adjusted its official histories, and Dutch survivors who talked about the special rescue operation were gently discouraged or dismissed as confused about the details. This governmental cooperation in rewriting history demonstrates how malleable official narratives can be when institutions coordinate. If both Canadian and Dutch authorities agree that something happened a certain way, that becomes the official truth regardless of what actually occurred. Only the testimony of survivors and the courage of historians willing to challenge official accounts eventually forced the truth to emerge. The legacy of Operation Phantom Shield extends beyond the specific operation to broader questions about civil-military relations, individual moral responsibility, and the nature of heroism. Morrison and his men demonstrated that sometimes ordinary soldiers possess moral clarity that their superiors lack. The High Command made a defensible strategic decision to prioritize the main advance over a risky rescue operation. Morrison made a different decision based on moral conviction that tens of thousands of civilian lives couldn't be sacrificed to strategic convenience. Both positions had merit, which is what makes the story so compelling and uncomfortable. In military ethics courses, Operation Phantom Shield is now studied as a case example of the tension between lawful orders and moral imperatives. Students debate whether Morrison was a hero or a criminal, whether his men should have been decorated or court-martialed, whether the operation's success justifies the violations that made it possible. There are no easy answers, which is precisely why the case is valuable for training future military leaders who may face similar impossible choices. The story also resonates beyond military contexts. In any hierarchical organization, there are moments when individuals must choose between following orders and following their conscience. Morrison's example shows both the potential power and the potential cost of choosing conscience. He saved 53,000 lives and was rewarded with threats, silence, and official denial. That's a powerful deterrent for anyone considering similar moral courage. But his example also shows that sometimes one person's refusal to accept the unacceptable can change the world. For the Dutch people, Operation Phantom Shield has become a symbol of the deepest form of solidarity, strangers risking everything for strangers. The Canadian soldiers had no connection to the Dutch civilians in the camps. They didn't share language, culture, or nationality. They gained nothing personal from the rescue operation and risked their careers, freedom, and lives. They did it anyway because they believed that humanity transcends nationality and that mass murder is everyone's business to prevent. This ethos of universal human solidarity seems almost naive in our modern cynical age, but it was real and it was powerful enough to motivate hundreds of people to extraordinary acts. The Dutch resistance fighters who guided evacuees, the farmers who shared their hidden food, the civilians who sheltered refugees, none of them knew the people they were helping, but they helped anyway. That spirit of unconditional human solidarity is rare and precious, and Operation Phantom Shield demonstrates what becomes possible when enough people embrace it simultaneously. The children who were saved in 1945 are now in their 80s. Many have spent their lives telling younger generations about the Canadians who came in the night, who carried them through the forest, who gave them a future when death was already scheduled. These testimonies have preserved the emotional truth of Operation Phantom Shield even when official records denied its existence. The lived experience of 53,000 people couldn't be completely erased, no matter how much effort went into classifying the documentary evidence. This points to an important truth about historical memory. Official records are powerful, but they're not omnipotent. Lived experience, oral testimony, and collective memory can preserve truth even when institutions try to bury it. The survivors of Operation Phantom Shield kept the story alive through decades of official denial, and ultimately their persistence forced the truth into the open. History belongs not just to those who write the official records but to those who remember what actually happened. The final chapter of the Operation Phantom Shield story is still being written. As of 2024, only 3 of Morrison's original 240 volunteers are still alive, all over 100 years old. The last living member, Private James McDougall, gave his final interview in 2023 at age 101. His words capture something essential about what the operation meant to those who lived it. We didn't feel like heroes. We felt scared and way over our heads. But we couldn't just let those people die, you know? Once you know something terrible is going to happen and you have the power to stop it, you can't just walk away. You live with what you do, but you also live with what you don't do. I'd rather live with the memories of those terrible weeks than with the knowledge that I could have saved 50,000 people and chose not to because I was afraid or because someone told me not to. We did the right thing even if it was the wrong thing according to the rules. I've had 80 years to think about it, and I'd make the same choice again. That's the legacy of Operation Phantom Shield. Not just the 53,000 lives saved, but the example of moral courage in impossible circumstances, the demonstration that rules and orders and hierarchies sometimes must yield to fundamental human decency. The men who conducted that operation weren't superhuman. They were clerks and farmers and factory workers in uniform, ordinary people who did extraordinary things because the situation demanded it and they couldn't live with themselves if they didn't try. Their story was buried for 70 years because it made powerful institutions uncomfortable. The truth emerged anyway because enough people refused to let it die. That's its final lesson. Truth has a persistence that outlasts classification stamps and official denials. The story of what really happened in the Veluwe Forest in April 1945 survived decades of intentional erasure because the people who lived it knew it mattered. They were right. It matters profoundly, not just as history but as an example of what humans are capable of when they choose courage over convenience, conscience over compliance, and moral duty over self-preservation. The 53,000 people who lived because of Operation Phantom Shield went on to have children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. Today their descendants number in the hundreds of thousands, a living legacy of one unauthorized operation in the final days of a terrible war. Every one of those lives exists because a Canadian colonel and 240 volunteers decided that orders weren't more important than human lives, that rules could be broken when breaking them meant the difference between mass murder and mass rescue. That's the secret Canadian unit that saved over 50,000 civilians and was erased from all official war records. Not secret because they were elite special forces conducting clandestine operations, but secret because their success was too uncomfortable to acknowledge. Their story is a testament to the best and worst of human institutions, the capacity for extraordinary heroism and the impulse to bury anything that challenges official narratives. Now, finally, the truth stands in the light where it always belonged, a permanent reminder that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who refuse to be heroes in the officially approved ways.